Well, I want to welcome everyone to the porch. So this is something we gather here every Tuesday night at 7, and it's a place for young adults defined by 20s and 30s to gather and to worship and to hear teaching relevant to that age group. But don't panic if you're out of that age group, okay? I see some of you, oh no. No, it's okay that you're here. We wanted to open this up. We felt that this topic was so relevant and so good and actually so well received on Sunday that we wanted to open it up to the entire body and really to the city to come and just to hear as we continue a creation conversation. This is a topic, this is a story, this is a conversation that actually started on Sunday as we had Dr. Meyer and Dr. Berlinski and Dr. Behe here, and as they just started talking about this idea of evolution and creation and the Bible and how does it combine and where does it fit and where does it not. And so tonight, we have a really special treat for you guys as we continue that conversation with Dr. Ray Bohlin. Dr. Bohlin is the president of Probe Ministries, or probe.org. And I will just tell you a quick kind of anecdotal story. When I came into the faith, about 8 years ago, I was extremely frustrated with the church as I had all of these questions, and I felt like my church at the time continued just to kind of point me to a faith. Well, you just have to have faith. And my questions were some of logic and intellect, and no one really sat down and toiled with me until I stumbled into actually this church, and someone pointed me to resources to those questions, sat down and toiled with me in those questions. And one of the resources they pointed me to was probe.org. And I can remember sitting at my desk and just spending hours upon hours, unbeknownst to my employer, on probe.org. And later had the opportunity and the absolute pleasure just to sit across the table from Dr. Bohlin and even ask him some of those questions. I want to introduce Ray to you guys. Now, Ray has a long resume, and so I had to write it down. But he is the president of Probe Ministries, as I said. He graduated in his undergrad from the University of Illinois and has his bachelor's in zoology. He received his Master's of Science from molecular biology from North Texas State University. He received a Master's of Science in molecular biology from the University of Texas at Dallas, and then also his PhD. And Ray, I messed one up. What was the first Master's?
Population genetics.
Population genetics.
To most people, that won't make much difference, but that's okay.
Yeah, well, just to those that it matters to. He also co-authored The Natural Limits to Biological Change and the Basic Questions on Genetics, Stem Cell Research, and Cloning, and was a general editor of Creation, Evolution, and Modern Science. If you guys would, please welcome Dr. Ray Bohlin.
So we're ready to go?
Let's rock.
All right. There were a number of questions texted in on Sunday evening, and we've collected all of those, and I received them 5 or so o'clock last night, and the staff here had already highlighted about 18 or so of those questions that we definitely wanted to try and cover tonight. And I've tried to take those questions and categorize them a little bit, and we'll kind of go through them with some semblance of reason and order. There's a basic question that somebody asked, and I can understand why this question would surface if you haven't had much background in biology or evolution or whatever. They simply asked, what is Darwinian theory? And I think that's really a good place to start tonight to make sure, in one sense, we really are talking about the same thing. Darwin made just a couple of very basic observations about the natural world. First of all, he noticed that among different kinds of organisms within a different species, there were different varieties. He was able to notice, for instance, that breeders of all types, he eventually bred pigeons himself, and he was able to see for himself how from one basic stock of pigeon, if you just breed them the right way and then apply some intelligence to it, you can arrive at a lot of different kinds of pigeons from one basic species or one starting pair. So that told him that there were almost hidden or underlying variations that were present in all organisms, and that was the first major observation. And the second thing, using that same illustration of artificial breeders, he was able to see, well, when people apply intelligence, we're able to uncover all these things. And he just asked the question, I wonder if nature can do the same thing. Might there be a process in nature that also somehow selects certain varieties over others? And using a number of different connections, different authors and ideas, he came up with the idea of natural selection. And natural selection simply argues that amongst all these varieties, some will allow an organism to survive and reproduce a little bit better than others. And those that do aid that process of survival and reproduction, they will over time tend to dominate the overall species. And things will change over time, not by intelligence, he said, but simply by nature, in a sense, selecting or weeding out the unfit and therefore leaving the more fit behind to represent the species. That's natural selection, and that's a real process. We've made lots of observations about it in nature. Lots of different organisms have proved, been good test cases that natural selection is real. But what he also did is he extended it not just from observations we make among living organisms, but he extended it into the past. He said, if this is what we can observe in organisms and in species today, if we give them a lot more time, I wonder how much variation, how many different kinds of organisms would result if we just allowed this natural process to take place. And so that was the other thing that eventually drove him, with other ideas, assumptions, pieces of data, to say that ultimately all of life, and that's where his tree of life came from, most likely descended, initially he said, from one or several common common ancestors. Eventually he narrowed that down to just one. That one form of life, through those variations combined with natural selection, would result in all the different life forms we have today. That is the Darwinian theory, the Darwinian hypothesis. And what's critical to that, especially in the context of modern biology today, is that it's a purely natural, unplanned, undirected process. Some evolutionary writers have said if you took the whole, if you could videotape the evolutionary process over, they would say, 500 or so million years, and simply wound it back to the beginning and allowed the tape to replay, they would say it would end up with a completely different result. We as human beings probably wouldn't even be here because it's natural, it's contingent, there's no direction, there's no plan, there's no purpose to it. And so when people define or talk about evolution today in that context, they are almost always certainly describing it as unplanned and without purpose. Now, one other questioner mentioned about a biology professor they had, and I'd imagine many of us in here have had these kind of experiences. Said, my biology professor insisted that evolutionary fossils have been found all over the world, and that is irrefutable evidence of evolution. True? Well, aspects of that statement are true. And sometimes, I have to take this question with a little bit of a grain of salt. I don't know who the professor was. I don't know what they actually said. I don't know what they meant to say. And I don't know how this person heard what they actually said. So you can understand there's a little uncertainty here. But what I'm assuming the professor was talking about is that we have found fossils all over the world that demonstrate that slow, gradual, incremental process of evolution that Darwin talked about. Darwin himself, as was mentioned on Sunday night, talked about, I can't have evolution happening in big jumps and starts. It's got to be a slow, gradual, incremental process. Now, are there series of fossils that, with an evolutionary assumption, could they demonstrate some kind of evolutionary process over time? And I would be one who would say, yeah, you can find a few sequences of fossils like that would seem to appear in the right periods of time. They seem to follow the right sequence. David Berlinski talked about one of those on Sunday night, the whale series, the evolution of whales from a land mammal organism. And he said there were about 6 or 7. And one of his criticisms of that idea was that, okay, you've got maybe 6 or 7 intermediates from a land-based organism to a fully aquatic organism, but there should have been at least 50,000 of those intermediate species. We only got 6 or 7. What's the problem? How many do you need to demonstrate real evolution? So we have a couple of those series of arrangements of fossils. The problem that I see that evolution has faced and continues to face is that not that we can find bits and pieces like that, but that we should find transitional species, literally, as this question suggested, all over the world and in all types of formations with all types of species. And that is precisely what we do not find. We find a few examples. We find most of them in what we as biologists call vertebrates, those who have the internal skeletons, the fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, us. We're vertebrates. We find rather teasingly interesting transitional fossils among those types. But that's a very small, minute fraction of the fossil record. Most, 90% or more of the fossil record is composed of what we call invertebrates. Invertebrates that do not have the internal skeleton. Insects are invertebrates. Worms are invertebrates, those kind of critters. And we don't find transitions between the different kinds of invertebrates. We don't find anything in the fossil record, practically. You can find one group that's talked about a lot is this little ant type thing. It's kind of an intermediate between an ant and a wasp. E. Wilson likes to talk about that one. I'm one of those not terribly impressed by that. Ants and wasps are real similar stuff. The fact that if we would find the intermediate between those two, that doesn't bother me a lot. I need a little bit more than that with invertebrates. So do we find fossils? Yeah, fossils all over the world. Do we find transitional fossils? There are a few, but there should literally be tens of thousands of them, and that's not what we find. One person said, "I'm confused." Was anybody else confused at some point? There are a lot of you who didn't raise your hands, I understand. I'm confused, and I think I'm going to try to read it as I think the person meant it. You know, text messaging, sometimes on these kind of topics, I'm trying to figure out what they're saying. I'm confused. If he's saying that maybe we were just created by random processes. In other words, I think he's saying that maybe we were created by random processes simply because he's making me consider that. You understand the question? Did I try to clarify? What I think he's asking is, did he talk about so much, did Steve, Mike, Dr. Bohlinsky, did they talk about random processes and the possibility of those generating human beings simply because they wanted you to understand it better? Now do you understand the question? Did I phrase it a little bit better that time? Yes. They did spend a lot of time trying to help you to understand what Darwinian evolution was, what even from the origin of the universe, the Big Bang, the natural processes involved, because that is specifically the fully naturalistic view, as I indicated earlier about Darwinism. It's a fully naturalistic, unplanned, non-purposive process. A lot of times, as in the Christian community, we don't really understand that that's how evolution is being presented. That's what it is. By definition, it's unplanned, it's non-directed, it's without purpose, by definition. And we sometimes think we can, and we'll get to that a little bit later, we can merge, a purpose and evolution, and we can have both at the same time. Well, how scientists define evolution today, no, you can't. Those two don't go together. In their minds, you're either one or the other. Either there is plan and purpose or there is not. And they define evolution as having no plan or purpose. So sometimes we have to take a little bit of time to lay that groundwork and make sure you understand that when you read about evolution in your textbooks, whether it's your kid's high school text or junior high text or even your college text, when they use the word evolution in that context, they mean undirected, unplanned. They don't always tell you that, but that's what they mean. One more specific question about this said, since evolution takes time, could it not have conceivably taken billions and billions of years? Yes. No. Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, that's how evolution is described. In many ways, evolution requires millions of years, especially biological evolution. In the current scheme, the first biological life is suggested to have come about by natural process somewhere around 3.8, 3.9, 4 billion years ago. And they need that much time. Even some of us would say, okay, even if you get that much time, it still doesn't work. That's not enough time. You need even more time than that for it to work. But yeah, it has to take millions. By necessity, by definition, it requires billions of years. They themselves say that the complexity of living things, and Steve gave you a couple of quotes by other evolutionists who say, life looks as if it's been designed. And that's the specific conclusion they draw from that is to say, because of their incredible complexity and the fit of the organism to its environment, they could not have just happened by chance. It needs to be a slow, incremental process over millions and billions of years. One other question that was asked, but I'd like to go ahead and take some time with it, said, for Darwinians, explain who made the mass that exploded into the Big Bang. Now, you have to understand, Steve dealt with this a little bit on Sunday, both in the morning and in the evening. But the Big Bang hypothesis literally has to say that there came into existence a particle, as they say, that was infinitely dense and occupied no space. It's 7:30 at night, I know, but try to think about that for a minute. Infinitely dense, occupied no space. What's density? I like to simply say it's the technical way is to say mass per volume. I like to say, what is density? It's the amount of stuff you got in the amount of space you got. That's density. Well, they're saying that this particle is infinitely dense. All the mass of the universe is contained into a tiny, tiny particle, infinitely dense, and it occupied no space. It's legitimate for us to ask, was there really anything there? That's a tough thing to imagine. But that's what the equations have gotten them to. That's what the observations of the expanding universe, pulling that back down, that's what they've arrived at. And it's critical to understand that that particle itself could not be eternal. There's a very good reason for it. That particle, they say, literally just some quantum fluctuation from nothing to something. The particle is here, it immediately explodes, and here comes the universe. Why is that? If the particle is infinitely dense, then if it exists for eternity and then suddenly explodes, well, something internal had to change. Otherwise, it would have exploded earlier, right? But it's infinitely dense. How can anything change in that incredibly tightly packed particle? They know it can't. So the particle itself cannot be eternal. So when you ask them, where did this particle, this mass come from that exploded into the Big Bang? Have you ever seen Disney's Jungle Book, animated Jungle Book? Yeah, you remember the vulture sitting on the limb? What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? Well, when you ask them where'd the particle come from, it's a similar answer. I don't know. Where do you think it came from? I don't know. And I'm not trying to make fun. I'm really not. That's really where they're at. They have no idea. They're trying to mess around with quantum physics and quantum fluctuations, but the strange thing about that is quantum mechanics is a property of this universe. We have no way of knowing whether quantum energy or gravitational fields would have worked before this universe existed. In physics, you really can't do that. You're not left with anything to work with. Once the person asked, do most secular scientists today believe in evolution? Absolutely. 99+% sometimes, they believe in some kind of evolution. And Steve talked about that a little bit. You've got to be really careful with the word evolution. It means lots of things to lots of different people. Always have that word defined if you're going to talk and involve in discussion. So the next category has to do with something they didn't really talk about much the other night, but it's in the back of our minds. One person asked, is there a stance that combines creation with evolution? For example, an intelligently designed creation that continues to evolve. There is such a stance. We ordinarily describe that as theistic evolution, those who believe God used evolution as his means to create. Some of them wanted to change that. They don't like the idea that theistic is the adjective and evolution is the noun, so they sometimes prefer to call themselves as evolutionary creationists, but it's really the same thing. And yeah, they tend to think that God really used evolution as his means to create, but as I've already defined for you, as most scientists use evolution, it's unplanned, undirected. You don't need God for something that's unplanned and undirected. There's no need for the supernatural whatsoever. That's part of the reason they define it that way. So for myself personally, I find that to be it's an uncomfortable position. And I'll freely admit to you that most theistic evolutionists that I've had contact with, they're the most difficult people for me to talk to. In many ways, they've been scientifically trained, and they've come to a resolution where they can be comfortable in the church context because they say they believe in an intelligent, designed creation. And then when they get into their academic environment, they can also be comfortable there because I also believe in evolution. And they put the two together. Francis Collins, the former head of the Human Genome Project, is a theistic evolutionist by his own admission. That's how he would classify himself. But they've come to a resolution. It's usually been a painful process to go through because they are threatened themselves with either having to abandon their faith or their belief in a personal God, or they're going to have to ditch their science, which is their career, and it's a really tough place to be. And they finally come to a resolution, and they can be comfortable in their faith, they can be comfortable in their science, and then somebody like an intelligent design person or a creationist or whatever comes along and tries to tell them, you've got it all wrong and you need to rethink this. Well, they're not really excited about doing that. They're really not excited about that at all. If you go to our Christian colleges and universities, the vast majority of their biological faculties will be theistic evolutionists. And that's just the plain and simple truth of it all. I'm not going to name any universities or colleges. You're free to come up to me afterwards and ask, but I don't want to get in trouble that way. So, yeah, there is that possibility. I think it is poor science, and I think it's poor theology on both counts. I think they misunderstand evolution, and I think they misunderstand the Creator. One way that I've looked at it is to realize that having been a student of evolution, population genetics, which was mentioned, that could be called evolutionary biology today. And I was a Christian when I was at North Texas studying that, and I drank deep at the well. I wanted to learn evolution from the people who said this is how it works, and I wanted them to try to convince me of it. I was open. I was skeptical, but open. So I've drunk deeply at the well, and I understand how evolution is supposed to work, and at its heart, it is a rather cruel, uncaring process. It's mechanistic, and it doesn't care about compassion. It doesn't care about who survives. It just is. That's the way it is. And as I tried to think about that for myself initially as a young believer in graduate school and so forth, the big disconnect I found in some of the reading I did was that, whenever you try to understand a work of art, any kind of work of art, you can, like if you look at a series of Van Gogh paintings, you can understand, even if you're not an art critic or art historian or a student of art, that you watch it and you said, there was something wrong in this man's mind. something is not fitting together for him. You can see in the colors he uses, the brush strokes, the subjects he chooses, everything. His self-portraits change over time. You can see his internal struggle. Well, I say that because if God is the creator, then we can look at his creation not just for evidence that he exists, but it should tell us something about who he is. And if evolution at its heart is it's not, the whole idea of red in tooth and claw is a bit exaggerated, I'll give you that. But it's still an extremely uncaring, unproductive, sometimes very wasteful and inefficient process. And when I look at the God who is the person of Christ in the Scriptures, he's anything but. When he talked on the Sermon on the Mount, what did he tell us? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the peacemakers. The poor in spirit and the peacemakers do not survive in an evolutionary world. They just don't. They don't fit. They don't work. They get pushed aside. And so even at a deep theological, and as I'm saying here, also a scientific level, I don't find that theistic evolution works. I really don't. Had a few questions about common descent. Anything else coming in here?
Sure,
okay.
lots.
Oh, lots. Oh, okay. You're being kind then. All right. Common descent, that was a bit of an issue last night, I think. And first, why do intelligent design theorists not dispute the common descent theory? And interesting, they said, when most species do not share related forms and functions. I would not agree with that last part of the statement. Many, many species share a great deal of related forms and functions. If you looked at all the cellular processes in your human cells, they're going to be very, very similar to all the processes that go on in a chimpanzee's cells. We do have a lot of common form and function, sometimes between very unrelated species. There are cellular processes going on in your cells that resemble almost identically processes that go on in bacteria. How they make energy, how that little molecule he talked about, ATP. Well, almost every biological organism uses ATP as its energy molecule. And they all make it about the same way. We have some very similar related forms and functions. Now, does that automatically argue for common descent? It's certainly one conclusion you can come to. But as someone who also is open to the design perspective, again, when you turn to the similar artist of Vincent van Gogh, any art critic who looks at a couple of paintings and you say, I don't know, who did this? If it's a Van Gogh, they're going to know. If it's a Picasso, they're going to know. If it's Raphael, they can pick it out. They recognize that design. They recognize that artistic expression. There are common features, ways to use the brush, ways to use the colors, way they use shadow and light. There's a commonality to it. Why? Not because there's common descent from one painting to the other, but because what? There's a common designer. I would be very troubled, honestly, about the character and nature of the designer if all organisms were built upon different biochemical foundations. I would find that very confusing. What kind of God is this, man? I can't figure out where he's going, what he's doing, what he's up to. All this stuff is different. That wouldn't make a lot of sense to me. So, yeah, we do share a lot of forms and functions, but that's not necessarily an argument for evolution. Another question about common descent. Interesting question. This perspective says, how do we explain universal common descent with what the Bible says about God creating all the beasts and then man? Well, if you were a theistic evolutionist, as we described earlier, that would not be a difficult task. Because they would simply say that God created all of the different kinds and beasts and then man through the process of biological evolution. That was his process. That was his creative mechanism. And since I am one who is skeptical of common descent, and that's a whole, that's another 2-hour time together, so we're not going to go too far down that road. But I don't think you can put those two together. I think God's saying something specific. The word kind in Genesis 1 is something we don't know a lot about. The Hebrew word itself is a bit difficult to place. Traditionally, we have kind of taken that into the Latin, and that's the Hebrew word for kind. Our word species comes from the Latin word for kind. We kind of initially thought maybe they're the same thing. Probably not. When God created kinds, we don't really know what that means. They said to reproduce after their own kind. Well, for the biologist in me, I wish God had been a little bit more precise. Reproduce after their own kind. Well, one thing that we do know that would have happened if the flood was a universal event, and Noah really did take somehow all of the representatives of different animals on there. He only took 2 of each kind, by the way. He didn't take 2 of every species. That's an interesting perspective. But what some people like to suggest is that a good example would be the dog kind. That maybe at creation, God created a population of dog-like creatures. And after the flood, there was some microevolution, we would call it, that may have taken place. And you would have gotten things like the common gray wolf, the domestic dog eventually from the wolf, the African wild dog and the Australian dingo and perhaps even foxes. Those may have all descended from the original dog created kind. Maybe. That's the fun thing about science. Is that the truth? Boy, I don't know. Let's have some freedom in the scientific community. Let's see if that works. Are there some real barriers, some real limits to biological change that we could really define? You can't break out of this. There are specific biological limits in place that don't let you evolve beyond this point. Right now, that kind of research, you'd never get anywhere with it. You would never get it funded, and they'd laugh you out of the university. We don't have that kind of freedom today to pursue those kinds of things.
Ray, I have a question.
Yeah.
Intelligent design versus creationism, are those the same things? Can you describe the differences?
Well, that's one of those yes and no answers. Almost creationism usually is understood, a creationist specifically, whatever position they have on the age of the earth, we'll cover that in a little bit, we'll get there. They start with a biblical interpretation. A creationist starts with Genesis, starts with the various creation texts in Scripture, and formulates an idea from Scripture of what they think creation means and how they can apply it scientifically. And then they approach the scientific data. Intelligent design does not depend upon a particular reading of a biblical text. Intelligent design takes a different approach and simply begins with the scientific data. What can we tell from the scientific data alone about whether things are designed or not? That's the only question design people are asking. Can we tell from the science alone whether things are designed, intelligently designed, or not? And under the intelligent design umbrella, you've got all kinds of creationists out there who put themselves under that umbrella. You've got a lot of people who would call themselves creationists who don't like intelligent design. They would never call themselves an intelligent design person. Why? Because intelligent design does not claim to be able to define who the designer is. If you want to answer the question of who the designer is, you have to take not just the scientific evidence, but you've got to pull in philosophy, you've got to pull in theology, you've got to pull in other ways of knowing. The scientific data alone does not tell you who the designer is. It can't do that. It's unable. And so that hesitancy based on the science alone to identify designers, why many creationists would not put themselves under the ID umbrella. Hopefully that clarified it a little bit.
So you're saying that they both point to a creator, but creationism points to a specific creator.
A specific named creator based upon biblical text, a certain interpretation of biblical text.
Okay.
Yeah. One person asked, in what way is intelligent design falsifiable? And I'm going to try to be fairly brief with that because it can be a fairly complex philosophical question. What that implies is that real science is always, you can tell it's science because it's falsifiable. We can think of a way that would show us it's not true. The reality is, in science, that's really hard to do. It's extremely hard to do. Some people would say, and if evolution would not be true if you found human fossils in strata that's 3 billion years old. Evolution would be absolutely falsified. It's not true. Well, okay, I can accept that. But the reality is, how evolution is studied moment by moment, day by day, you don't run across those kind of things. And what they do is there's lots of events about evolution that are completely unobservable. We can never repeat, we'll never see it. The first origin of life, we will never see it again, we can't rewind the tape. We'll never really know exactly how that happened. The best we can do is take that idea, and if life arose by purely natural processes, we might predict we'd find these kinds of processes in living cells today. And then you look into living cells today and you try to see whether your prediction is true or false. Now, if your prediction is false, does that automatically mean life did not come about by natural process? No, it just shows that your particular idea about it didn't work. An ID would be very much the same way. Intelligent design, as my friend Paul Nelson likes to refer to it, it's just another tool in the toolkit. We're all about trying to figure out how science works. We're all trying to figure out, how biology, how life works. And if the idea that things have been intelligently designed gives us another tool that helps us understand and elucidate the various processes of life, then it's a valuable tool, and it is scientific. There are some, there's a kind of a nice little tale that goes around among philosophers of science that two philosophers of science are walking down the hallway of the university, and one asks the other, so what do you think science is? The other one says, well, science is simply what scientists do. There's a real precise definition for you. And that's really where that whole question is, trying to paint intelligent design as not science because they think it isn't falsifiable is a false prediction. That's really not a true category of science. And one interesting thing about that is if you come up with an idea, you say, this is science, and I'm going to give you a falsifiable prediction from that, and then my theory is falsified. Well, guess what? Your theory is still science because it was falsified. That qualified it as science, right? Now, it's bad science, apparently. and that's the thing. You can come up with bad science, science that works, science that contributes to knowledge, science that contributes to our understanding of how things work, and then there is science that doesn't help get us there. There's bad science. All you can really do today is it good science, is it bad science? Does it help, does it hurt? And we simply want the opportunity to see whether intelligent design can help. We think it's legitimate. We think it's a good approach. And you don't need a religious perspective to do ID science. There was a question about that abbreviated thing, TTSS. So what about the evolution of TTSS? Was a question. It is an important question, and that refers to how could the bacterial flagellum actually evolve? Where did it come from? How did it get there? And intelligent design suggests it couldn't have happened by purely undirected, unplanned, purposeless processes. There's clear intent, there's clear intelligence involved in constructing something like that.
Ray, you may want to give some context in case.
Yeah, the flagellum, I'm going to show you a little video here because there's further questions about the flagellum. The bacterial flagellum is a little whip-like structure on the end of bacteria, and it rotates in a kind of a corkscrew fashion, and then it can also turn 180 degrees, and that corkscrew continues to go so that it can go 360 degrees based upon that corkscrewing action. And there are over 40 different protein parts to a bacterial flagellum, all of them necessary either for the construction of the flagellum or for its function. Many of those that are necessary for construction means it doesn't get made at all, and of course it doesn't function if it's not there. And so some have suggested they have found this little structure that's only 10 proteins, not 40, and it's similar to a flagellum, and all its purpose is to kick toxins out of the cell, and it's pathogenic bacteria that have this little system. And it has 10 proteins that are similar to the flagellar 10 of the flagellar 40 proteins. And what some people suggest is, well, see, maybe this simpler machine evolved first, and then the flagellum was just kind of built piecemeal on top of that. So here, it's not irreducibly complex. We can get a smaller version that actually performs a function in the cell. Now, there are numerous problems with that, and the only one I'll mention is simply that only describes 10 of the proteins. The other 30 are completely unique. You do not find similar proteins in any other part of the cell. They're only used in the flagellum. You still have to account for all 30 of those. And that's not an easy thing to do. You haven't really reduced the problem at all. The other interesting thing about that is that you find the flagellum throughout all bacterial lineages. Almost all different kinds of bacteria have some species, one or other, who have a flagellum. And so the implication is if you find it all along the tips and nodes of the tree, if you want to follow an evolutionary tree back to a common ancestor, they say that common ancestor had to have a flagellum. Otherwise, it couldn't spread to almost everybody out here. Well, the thing about that little secretory system, the type 3 secretory system, TTSS, is that you only find, well, it's here, and it's there, and it's up there. You don't find it across the board. The implication there being that probably is a degenerated flagellum. It didn't come first, it came second. So what you've got is the fully fledged bacterial flagellum at the very bottom of this evolutionary tree, and you haven't solved anything there. Well, some questions dealt with the flagellum about the computer models, and here's one question. I got a little video I'm going to play for you here. It said, by what evidence are the computer-generated models made? Can you see these machines via microscope or the machine presumed? Question that kind of asking the same thing. If all you have to show for the micro machines inside of cells are computer animations, how can you know that those machines are actually there? It's a great question. That's always a good question in these kind of discussions, is simply asking, how do you know that? and it's with something that is microscopic as the flagellum, how do you know that stupid thing's really there? I like these computer animations, but come on. How small does this thing have to be? Now, I'm going to play you just a short segment from our Redeeming Darwin video that we use a clip from Unlocking the Mystery of Life, and I'm going to show Behe talking about a flagellum, and I'll stop it at a certain point because he'll show you a photograph of the base of the flagellum, and I'll talk about that for just a second and then replay it for you. Are we ready to put that up there? The bacterial flagellum gives every appearance of a humanly designed rotary motor. Let's let Dr. Michael Behe, a biochemist from Lehigh University, describe his thoughts when he first saw a diagram of a flagellum.
In speaking on the topic of scientific naturalism and evolution...
During the early 1990s, at a series of academic conferences, Bohlin first shared his doubts about the ability of natural selection to construct complex molecular machines. One machine particularly attracted his attention.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called the bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed, that's no chance assemblage of parts.
Bohlin's reaction was not surprising, for the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron micrographs like this one to identify the parts and...
Did you hear what he said? If you enlarge the flagellum 50,000 times, what you're looking at is an actual electron micrograph or electron photograph of the base of a bacterial flagellum. We've seen these things. We know they exist. And part of the other reason they know they exist is that once they find out the genes for all these different parts that make these different proteins, what they will do is then knock out one of the proteins and see what happens. And then they can take another picture and say, oh, I see what's missing. I know what that protein, I know where it fits anyway. I have an idea what it does. Now I'm going to play the rest of it, and you'll see what they will do is they will begin adding in the pieces of the animations you've seen, and you begin to see this is real stuff. The flagellum is a real cellular machine, and they did it right.
In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
And even though there's...
All right, there we go. So yeah, we've actually taken pictures of it. We've got a pretty good idea that how we've constructed these animations is based on reality. Any other questions have come in before I launch into the age of the earth stuff? Or
Yeah, and maybe a good transitional question is I'm getting a lot on just dinosaurs and where do dinosaurs fit into Darwinian evolution as well as intelligent design?
Really, dinosaurs? I've never had that question before.
Yeah, I bet.
I'd like to answer that in the context of the age discussion I want to do here. I want to take about 10 or 15 minutes because I feel like what I need to do first of all is I need to establish some categories for you and give you a few definitions. And so bear with me a little bit. I'm going to do some little PowerPoint here that I've got, and we're just going to... This is from, by the way, I heard Todd mention to a group that stayed really late on Sunday night in one of the overflow rooms that continued to ask further questions. He referenced an article I wrote that's on our website called Christian Views of Science and Earth History, and that's what this is from. And I'm already going to be teaching at the Watermark Training Day on June 13th, and I've also just got a general title of Creation Evolution, but I'll probably go ahead and repeat this presentation for you then, because we're not going to have time to cover all of this. I have three different views that I talk about in this discussion: the recent creation view, the progressive creation view, and theistic evolution. And what I do is I walk through, and I'm only going to give you part of this here, but I give you what the theological and biblical foundations are for each view. And here what I'm going to do is give you the scientific considerations so you can begin to put some pegs and hang some things on and get a better understanding of these three different views. And then I actually walk through strengths and weaknesses, which I won't do tonight. But then I've got another thing based upon some questions people already asked about things like apparent age in the universe, recent creation. How do they define things? Recent creationists, or young earth creationists, young age scientific creationists, will say the earth and the universe are somewhere between 6 and 30,000 years old. Why do they say that? It's based upon their biblical interpretation of Genesis 1. The flood is an extremely important event in young age creationism, recent creationism. It was necessarily a universal flood, covered the entire earth, extremely catastrophic. It is the source of all the sedimentary strata where you find all the fossils. In this creationist view, nearly all the fossils in the fossil record were buried as a result of Noah's flood. They do talk about, as I mentioned earlier, evolution within kinds. The whole idea of like the dog kind and all the different species of dogs, dog-like creatures we've got today, that they're very comfortable with that idea. But no evolution between the kinds. So they would say, yeah, there is microevolution, but there is no macroevolution. No evolution on the big scale. You're not going to get dogs evolving into cats. You're not going to get salamanders evolving into frogs. That kind of change. Salamanders into different kinds of salamanders, yeah, but not salamanders into frogs. They're two different kinds of creatures. The progressive creationists change a few things. Well, first of all, they accept the great age of the universe. Progressive creationists say the earth and universe are billions of years old. The earth is 4.5 billion years old, and the universe is 13.7 billion years old. They do agree that God has directly intervened into nature at various points in time. Hard to discern exactly when, what God actually did, but God doesn't just start it and just let it unwind on its own. He directly intervenes in natural history. The flood, for the progressive creationists, you find lots of different perspectives on that. Some would say it's just a local flood in the Mesopotamian area. Some would say no, it was a worldwide flood, but it just didn't leave any geological scars on the surface of the earth. And they, again, microevolution, yes, but no macroevolution as well. So you can see areas of agreement with recent creation and areas of disagreement. And those folks, the theistic evolutionists, evolutionary creationists, God did create at least one original form. Maybe it did evolve from chemicals, whatever, not sure. But all the different life forms then were a result of natural process from that. Again, the earth and universe are billions of years old. And some would actually say God had to have used evolution as his means to create. Well, they say that because their view of God's sovereignty, they would say, is highly elevated, and they're uncomfortable with God intervening through the billions of years to add new things. That to them diminishes the power and glory and majesty and sovereignty of God. They would prefer, God is a bigger God to them if he just creates that particle that we talked about, and the Big Bang ensues, and God never has to touch it again. And it would, if you rewind the tape, it would rewind exactly the same way, because God built everything into that original particle and bang. And if God has to add things along the way, they say that, well, then God's like a creature. He can't get it right. He's having to enter back into creation to fix things along the way. They also say there was no direct intervention by God, most likely at any point in natural history. They draw a distinction between what they call salvation history, where God's miracles still apply. God still divides the Red Sea. Jesus really physically rose from the dead. But God never has to do those things in natural history. Natural history unfolds by natural events. The flood is local or tranquil. Again, the flood's not a critical event to many theistic evolutionists. And then they say both micro and macroevolution are real processes.
Ray, will you define those? We've gotten a lot of questions on just the
Okay.
idea of microevolution and macroevolution.
Probably could go back to one of these other ones, the young earth creation view. The idea of evolution within the kinds, that God created a dog group and all we get are different kinds of dog-like creatures out of that. That's microevolution. Macroevolution would be starting with a dog-like creature and somehow over time evolving lions and tigers and apes and humans, all from that original dog kind. That would be macroevolution. So yeah, it's kind of a wishy-washy thing. Some evolutionary biologists simply say that macroevolution is evolution above the species level. Microevolution is evolutionary changes that take place within the species. That's their distinction.
For example, adaptation or maybe a flounder's eye moving to the same side, and then microevolution or macro, the other one, whatever the other one is, would be like a species changing into or evolving into another species.
Yeah, simple adaptation to a change in the local environment would be a microevolutionary change. And we've got lots of examples of those, as I think I indicated earlier. And macroevolution is the process that could only be documented in the fossil record because we can't observe species long enough to actually observe ourselves. Macroevolution.
Another question that I've gotten a lot of is why are we not still evolving? If Darwinian evolutionists believe that we evolved from apes, why are we not still evolving? I think you just answered it.
Evolutionists would say we are. We are evolving. We're adapting to local environments, local situations. But a major evolutionary change we're not going to observe in our lifetime. What I want to do here is walk through a couple of just final thoughts about this idea. And what I really want to just emphasize here is I don't have a real hope that we will figure this out. I just scared a lot of you, didn't I? What do I mean by that? This whole issue of how we coordinate what science says, what the Bible says, and that this is going to involve some mysteries that, quite frankly, from my perspective, we're never going to really figure it out in this lifetime. And here's some of the reasons why. This is from a man named Davis Young, a geologist from Calvin College. This is his book, Geology and the Age of the Earth. And he made a concluding chapter, said, in the same way, I should be very much surprised if we had a unified knowledge of both the Bible and the world that had no loose ends. Why should theology and natural science ever be expected to agree fully when each by itself has plenty of loose ends? Some of you are a little concerned, maybe a little confused. What's he talking about? Well, science definitely has things we can't explain. We don't understand. The physicists will tell you that light is both a particle and a wave at the same time. They can't measure it as both at the same time, but it really is a particle and a wave simultaneously. And they will flat out admit to you, that doesn't make sense. I don't understand it. It doesn't work. We can't put it together, but the evidence tells us that's true. Science has its loose ends. We have some things we will not be able to fully explain. Theology has its loose ends too. If you're going to disagree with me on that, I'd like somebody to come up here and explain for all of us the incarnation. Anybody got that one figured out? Give a nice, precise description. How about sovereignty and free will? You got that one all pegged out for you? We have some mystery. I don't know about you, but I like my God to be bigger than me. I don't really want to be able to figure it all out. That would scare me. That's no longer God in a certain way of looking at things. And so theology, loose ends, science, loose ends. What he's saying is, why are you going to expect it all to make sense? We should not fall into the trap of thinking that somehow Scripture is more reliable or trustworthy if it is at every point backed up by the scientific evidence. Nor should we somehow suspect that Scripture may be untrustworthy if science does not back it up at every point. There is always going to be some mystery to these things. And don't ever lose track of that. If you feel you've got all these things answered, then you're as big as God is, and that would worry me. It'd worry me if I thought I had it all figured out. So his book, Christianity in the Age of the Earth. And I also like the way Francis Schaeffer put it in his book, No Final Conflict. We must take ample time, and sometimes this will mean a long time, to consider whether the apparent, notice that word apparent, that's highlighted for a reason. The apparent clash between science and revelation means that the theory set forth by science is wrong, or whether we must reconsider what we thought the Bible says. Now, I just scared a few of you. Reconsider what we thought the Bible says? We have the inerrant Word of God, and yes, we do. I fully ascribe to that. But that doesn't mean that I always understand what the inerrant Word of God is trying to tell me. There are some uncertainties. I'll give you an example. This is Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses here. And this is in a church in Florence. I don't remember the name of the exact church, but this sculpture has some really strange things about it. You can't really see it too well, but there's something really unusual about Moses' head. I don't know if you can see it, but there's these two things protruding out of his forehead. They almost kind of look like horns. The Hebrew word for that we understand today is Shekinah glory. Moses' radiant face because he had seen God, and he had to cover it because this face shone. There was a remnant of the glory of God just emanating from his face. It blinded people. It hurt them, so he had to cover it. At the time Michelangelo sculpted Moses, that term was not completely understood. We didn't really know what that phrase was referring to. Here's a little bit more of a close-up. Perhaps you can see the horns coming out of Moses' head. That's a pretty strange sculpture, folks. I don't care who you are, that's just weird. Why in the world would he do that? Well, the word for Shekinah glory was similar to the root word for goat horns. So, as literally as Michelangelo could, at the time, he interpreted that Moses must have had two horns coming out of his head because that's what the Bible said. That was his best understanding. But later, extra-biblical texts used the same word that were not the Old Testament. The same Hebrew word showed up, and the context clearly indicated the word meant God's radiant glory. And suddenly, a lot of theologians were a lot more comfortable. Oh, that makes a lot more sense. I can work with that one. The horns part, no, that was causing me trouble. Well, the reality is, maybe with some of these biblical texts and the science, maybe we don't have a full understanding of just what Moses was telling us and how he wrote things down in Genesis 1, 2, 3 through 11. Maybe there are still some uncertainties to this that we have yet to figure it out. We might change what we thought the Bible said. We've done it before as new information rises. Last question here about the age issue. What about the apparent age? Couldn't God simply have created a universe that looked billions of years old? If there is creation out of nothing, and Hebrews 11:3 seems to indicate that the worlds came about by the spoken word of God. There was nothing, and then there was something out of nothing. There must be apparent age. Adam was created as an adult, right? Even though he is only a few seconds old, he looked like he had a history. But he didn't. Now, how old Adam looked, I like to say, simply depends on how old you are today. I like to think he was about his mid-50s, personally.
I think he was 28.
Think he was 28? Oh, that's a relative decision, huh? But, you know, he looked like he had a history, but no, he was only a few seconds old. So if you create out of nothing, there has to be an appearance of age. But I have to ask the question, is there a point where apparent age becomes a bit of a deception? And I think it can, and sometimes that makes me uncomfortable. Here's what I mean. This whole thing of starlight and time. We had a specific question about this. Galaxies, other galaxies in our universe, must be millions of light years away. What does a light year mean? It's the distance light travels in a year. If something is 1,000,000 light years away, that means it took the light from that galaxy 1,000,000 years to get here. Okay? That's what it means, 1,000,000 light years away. We know that these distances have to be real. Otherwise, you and I would not be alive today. If all the galaxies of this huge universe were literally only 6,000 or 30,000 light years away, the radiation would be deadly and you could not survive on planet Earth. You simply couldn't do it. The nighttime sky would be absolutely brilliant. There would never be any darkness in any direction you look. So they have to be those great distances away. Younger age creationists don't question the distances to the faraway galaxies. What they say is that the light from these, some of them say, light from these distant objects were created in transit. That means I can see those things even in a short age universe simply because God created the light at the same time He created the object. And the lights for the whole distance traveled has always been there. Okay? So far, for a lot of people, that works. I can live with that. Parent age, okay. But we have observed dynamic events in some of these distant galaxies, like supernova explosions, an exploding star. From these distant galaxies, we've seen the event with all the proper accompanying radiation that ought to be there if a star really exploded. If the galaxy is even 100,000 light years away, we must conclude this event never happened. You with me on that? If it's 100,000 light years away and we've granted that the distances are real and we see an explosion from that galaxy, the light hasn't had enough time to get here yet. So what does that mean? God also created the light in transit of the entire supernova explosion in transit. He created it 30,000 light years away. And it appears like it happened in that galaxy, but the star never exploded. There hasn't been enough time for the light to get here. I'll be honest, that troubles me a little bit. It troubles me a little bit. We've observed the event with all the accompanying radiation. You know, it's kind of like seeing Adam's birth on video. Would that surprise you a little bit if God gave us a video of Adam's birth? Wait, I thought you gathered dust together and then you breathed, and he was an adult, right? Well, then how could he be born? That doesn't make any sense. Why would you give us that picture? Why would you give us that video? Well, this video of an exploding star from a distant galaxy is just like that. It's an event that never happened. Now, is there things for us to learn in God's created universe about how the universe is constructed if we do observe those things? Yeah, that there can be a purpose to God having done that. But I'm just being honest with you, it troubles me a little bit that God would intentionally create an event that never occurred. There's mystery. We need to respect creation's mystery and those who hold different views. I have friends on all sides of the fence here. I have friends who are both theologians and scientists who are young age. I have theologians and scientist friends who are old age. progressive creationists, and I even have a few friends who are theistic evolutionists. That's a perspective I already admit I've got a little more trouble with. But when somebody asks me, how old is the earth? How old is the universe? I have a simple answer. I don't know. I'm a confirmed fence sitter on this question. See, part of the issue is that, as I said, I know theologians and Old Testament scholars who disagree about how to interpret Genesis 1, and they're good, godly men and women. And I know scientists who are good, godly men and women whose walks with God I respect, who strongly disagree about how to interpret the scientific evidence for age. Hey, I'm a biologist, man. I don't know the Old Testament stuff. I don't know the physical dating methods, and you're expecting me to choose one or the other? I'm a little outclassed. I don't really quite know where to go with it. So yeah, I'm a fence sitter, and I'm getting more entrenched in that. It's probably just me getting older. I'm not going to change now, you know.
And Ray, what would you say to someone that says, well, what about Richard Dawkins? I mean, he knows, you know.
Well, yeah, it's fun to beat up on Richard sometimes, but you know, Richard wouldn't like to hear this, but in some respects, he's an evangelical's best friend. I say that because Dawkins is a consistent, materialistic atheist. He doesn't pull punches. He looks at the ramifications and he just says, there is no purpose to life. There is no good. There is no evil. It just is. The ones, in my mind, who are the really dangerous ones are the ones who try to hold on to a fully materialistic evolution, but yet try to sneak in purpose and meaning someplace else along the way and give our young people the impression that you can wed the two. That's what causes me pause. You get the straight stuff from Dawkins. He doesn't pull punches. And, you know, even people like him and Stephen Gould and others, you know, even though they are so dramatically opposed to our point of view, man, they give us some great quotes sometimes. And there's a part of me that, man, I hope they stick around. So yeah, Dawkins, the interesting thing for me is that my experience with evolutionary biologists is that they really think they are approaching the data objectively. They really think they don't have a worldview, they don't have a philosophy, and they've really convinced themselves, I'm just going with what I see. And I'm a product of the same scientific process today, and when I was a PhD graduate student, I wasn't even encouraged to take a course in the philosophy of science. Just learn how to do your experiments, learn how to interpret them, and learn how to draw up the next experiment for the next step. Don't think about all this. You don't need the philosophy. What we're graduating, our PhDs in science today, we're graduating a lot of overly qualified technicians. Really, that's what I am. What philosophy of science I've learned on my own, and thinking about competing ideas. Most of our researchers today don't understand. That's the biggest issue. That is the biggest problem. That is what Phil Johnson identified back in 1991 with Darwin on trial. The issue is naturalism within the scientific community. The data of science can be interpreted in different ways. My professor at North Texas last day called me in and said, Ray, if I've learned one thing in the years you've been my graduate student, is that I see how the data fits for you. Oh, really? He could see my perspective, and then he could see how I could approach the scientific data, and it makes sense. I said, I still disagree with you, but I see how it fits. And he later identified that as one of the things he learned from me, is that there are different ways to view things. And several years later, when I took to him my book, Natural Laws of Biological Change, and I had him read it for me to make sure evolution was represented fairly, he sat me down, we talked about it a little bit, and he said, oh, by the way, it's getting harder and harder to believe how all this stuff coming about in molecular and cell biology, how all that stuff happened by chance. Oh, really? You know, and in my mind I thought, bingo. It took me 2.5 years of intermittent conversations with him to get him to see there was another perspective on the science. And what suddenly happened in his mind was that now when new data came to him, he automatically compared and contrasted, interpreted materialistically, interpreted theistically. And suddenly he was finding some discrepancies. Now, I never had a chance to follow up much with that with him, but that was astounding to me. For the most part, for most of his scientific career, he had the blinders on. All he knew was scientific naturalism. So everything had to fit in that structure. But now, for a long time, he suddenly had a new way that things kind of fit. He didn't like it, but, oh man, all these things by chance, there's got to be a different way of looking at that. So that's the big issue. The data is the data, but it's the framework you use to try to interpret the data that makes the big difference. And all we're offering is another framework, another tool. It's not going to re-explain everything. We're not going to have to redefine biology by introducing intelligent design. A lot of stuff's just going to stay the same. But it might help us to elucidate things more clearly and more concretely.
Ray,
Other questions?
I'm fearful for my life because there are some avid dinosaur fans here that are unsatisfied. So
Unsatisfied, okay.
they're coming in all caps, Ray.
All right, all caps. Okay, here's the addendum. Dinosaurs fit in depending on your view of age. If you ascribe to the young universe and young Earth, thousands of years old, then dinosaurs must have walked the Earth with humans, because the days of creation are literal 24-hour days that are consecutive, and dinosaurs are animals, and they were created on day 6, along with human beings. So there is an intermittent period of about 1,500 years or so before the flood where humans and dinosaurs existed on the earth at the same time. And it was the flood that caused their extinction. That's one view. If you already ascribe to, as a believer, to great age, that the earth is 4.5 billion years old, you accept the current geological ages for all the sedimentary stratas, then dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, and there is no information in the Bible about dinosaurs. Humans and dinosaurs never coexisted. There's no issue here. There is one text that's coming up in our study of Job that causes people some pause. God talks to Job about two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. Behemoth is described in a very, very intriguing way. The behemoth is described as having legs like trees and built of iron, strong, the greatest of God's creatures, and had a tail like a cedar tree. And, it munched the grass, and the waves and the storms caused it no issue, no problems. It just walked right along, no fear. And his point to Job is, you'd be terrified by this thing. It's just one of my creatures, one of my toys. And he describes Leviathan. And Leviathan also sounds like a reptilian kind of creature, and it's mighty, it's huge. He dares Job to put a fish hook in it because if you did, you would never forget. I go out in the seas and I romp with Leviathan. He'd eat you for lunch, so who are you? But I loved, I think it was Carissa's journey entry today, summarized Job 38 with what? You human, me God. I loved it. That's what God said to Job. And in this context, the behemoth has all the qualities of something like a Diplodocus, or what we used to call a brontosaur-like dinosaur. And the main giveaway, they used to think, well, maybe it was an elephant, maybe it's a hippopotamus, and you think it said it had a tail like a cedar tree. Did you ever see the tail of an elephant or a hippopotamus? It's this little slender thing, and it's about that long, and it wouldn't remind you of a tree, not even of a sapling. I'm sorry. But a brontosaurus-like creature, which we know was a mistaken identity, but it's a term everybody recognizes. God's description, it sounds like a brontosaurus. Some have suggested that maybe there still was a memory of dinosaur-like creatures, and it's in the Bible. But then Leviathan causes you a little bit of a problem, because I forgot to add one thing about Leviathan. Excuse me. Smoke came out of his nostrils, and he breathed fire. Now, we can imagine that maybe there was some dinosaur that breathed fire, but I'm still waiting, and I'm not trying to be facetious or comment, I'm still waiting for a description of how that biologically would work. Maybe you'd breathe fire once, but you probably wouldn't do it a second time. I mean, it's a little rough on the throat, I would think. And maybe there's different ways of accomplishing that, but the implication seems to be, well, maybe behemoth is a description of a dinosaur and could be a real creature, but Leviathan sounds like, and most have described, many commentators simply describe both creatures as, I hesitate to use this word, but almost like mythological creatures that God is simply describing something that says, you're going to be terrified of this, and I just toy with it. And that was God's intent. That was God's purpose. So, are there dinosaurs in the Bible? Depends on your view of the age of the earth, honestly. Young age, yeah. Humans and dinosaurs lived together. Old earth, no, they died away 65 million years ago. And since I am a confirmed fence sitter of both those positions, I can't tell you where dinosaurs are in the Bible. I can just describe what other people suggest.
There was just a question that came in, and I was thinking, it said, if the flood destroyed the dinosaurs, why didn't the dinosaurs get on the boat? Yeah, a couple of you asked that, actually. Yeah. You guys are fast texters. We don't know, right? I mean, why didn't the dinosaurs get on the boat? Do you have
There are, from the young age perspective, there are two responses to that, and there are disagreements among these different positions. But one response is to say, God said, take two of every kind. Dinosaurs were on the ark. Now, that doesn't mean God took a mature T-Rex. They suggest maybe they were juveniles, or maybe even in the form of eggs. God brought the creatures to Noah. Noah didn't go out and find these things. God brought them to him. So maybe he just brought juveniles. The other one suggests that since the climate would change so dramatically after the flood that maybe dinosaurs weren't even bothered with. They were going to die out anyway. But then it said take two of every kind. So that's the usual response.
Well, I want to respect everyone's time, and Ray, your time, and shut us down here in a minute. But Ray, I want to thank you for extending your intellect and all of the research that you've done over the years. And so,
my pleasure. Thank you.
It is fun sharing this platform with the guys much smarter than I. And so 3 scientists were here the other night, with many accreditations. Many have written books, and I left with kind of that idea, just where we landed right there is, we don't know as much as we think we do. And even as Ray just talked about Dawkins, and be weary of the people that stick a firm stake in the ground. I would just say, hey, the Bible, Todd said this today in a staff meeting. I think he was quoting Spurgeon. Is that right, Blake? Spurgeon? Who said, the Bible is an anvil which has worn out many hammers. And it's true. It's true. Hey, this book we still have it, and we still lean on it for truth. Another question, just a great question that came through is, hey, we debate this idea of evolution. What about the resurrection? What about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? What about the ascension? What about that? That seems to surpass logic. It certainly does. That certainly does seem to go past any and every logic, unless there's a God. unless there's a creator. And I know that there's atheists in the room. I know because you text in and ask questions, and hey, that's great. Listen, I was one at one time. So was Josh McDowell. So was Lee Strobel. So was also many other scientists that have existed. And science, man science, has been corrected over the years. It, in and of itself, has even evolved. I'm not talking about true science, but man science, where once we thought the world was flat, even in Psalms where it says it's round. Scientists once argued against that idea, which is in the Bible. And so if you're here, were invited by a friend, I just want to tell you that you were created by a God who loves you, and that you were separated from him by your sin. And he sent his one and only Son to die for you. That is Jesus Christ. And he hung on the cross for you, and he rose from the dead so that you may enter into a personal relationship with him if you believe and confess that and trust in that. And this is a safe place, okay? If you're here, you're not here by chance. We are not afraid of your questions. Some of you asked some very specific ones. You're clearly educated. You're educated to this matter, as is Ray, as is Ray's peers, as is some other guys even on staff here. And so we invite your questions. We're not afraid of them. We're not challenged by them. We would ask that you stick around. Also, check out probe.org. There's lots of other resources like that online that we have access to just because of technology. And so please do. Please, if you're frustrated right now, you asked a very specific question that we didn't cover, I'd invite you to come forward. I'd invite you to email that in. And I do want to get an answer to you about that. What I'm going to do right now this is, like I said, something that we do every Tuesday night, and we always end in prayer. If you're not comfortable with that, feel free not to take part, but I'm just going to pray for us and pray for Ray. God, we do love you, and we thank you for creating the heavens and the earth. And we weren't there. We don't know exactly how that rolled out, but we do trust your word, and we are firm where it's firm, and we're flexible where it's flexible. And God, I thank you for men like Ray who you've just gifted. You've given a mind to use for you and to just advance knowledge of you. And I pray that anyone here that has questions that didn't get answered, that they're wrestling with this idea that they've given up their Tuesday night to go to a place of worship. I pray that they would not leave without getting those questions answered or wrestling with someone about those questions, God. And I pray that you would stir their hearts accordingly. And God, I just thank you for this time. I thank you that we can talk openly about these things. And we love you and thank you for Jesus. Amen.